Discover the unbelievable story of Poon Lim, the man who survived 133 days alone on a life raft in the Atlantic by any means necessary.
Chapter 1. The Fire and the Void. The 23rd of November, 1942. The South Atlantic that morning resembled a vast, deceptively calm mirror, its surface reflecting a pale, mist-shrouded sun that cast blurred, melancholy light across the steel deck of the British merchant vessel SS Ben Lomond. For the Chinese steward, Poon Lim, that day had begun routinely, with nothing to herald the approaching apocalypse. The rhythmic, soothing roll of the great vessel was a familiar comfort, vibrating from the powerful engines straight through the deck beneath his feet. The scent of sea salt mingled with the heavy aroma of engine grease and brewing coffee, creating the peculiar, stifling atmosphere of the merchant ship crossing wartime waters. Despite the ongoing global conflict, the boundless blue horizon seemed to promise a false security. The ocean was so flat and still that the boundary between sky and water seemed to blur, forming a single, infinite sphere of blue and gray. Poon Lim went about his daily duties, polishing the brass fittings and tidying the mess hall, while his thoughts drifted toward his distant home and those he loved, separated from him by thousands of nautical miles. His every movement was synchronized with the slow breathing of the ship, with that muffled thrumming that signified life. He had no idea that this mechanical harmony, this fragile bubble of normalcy in the middle of a hostile ocean, had mere minutes left before absolute annihilation. Time seemed to slow as the monotonous sound of waves breaking against the bow lulled the crew into complacency, while the sun climbed ever higher on the horizon, burning away the last remnants of the morning fog. The silence that reigned over the ocean was not a sign of peace. It was a held breath before a murderous blow. In the depths, beyond sight, a steel death lay in wait, merciless and precise, ready to tear this fragile world to pieces. Without the slightest warning, this lulling illusion of calm was brutally shattered by an explosion so powerful it seemed to tear apart the very fabric of reality. A German torpedo, fired from a U-boat lurking in the darkness of the ocean, struck the side of SS Ben Lomond with a deafening, apocalyptic roar. The sound was not merely heard, it was a physical blow, a shock wave that crushed the air and rolled through the steel skeleton of the ship like an earthquake. Poon Lim's world shattered into a million terrifying fragments in a fraction of a second. The explosion unleashed a blinding fireball that burst from the belly of the ship with savage fury, painting the blue sky in bloody shades of orange and black. Steel plates, inches thick, buckled and fractured like paper with a piercing, metallic scream that would be forever seared into the steward memory. The air instantly filled with acrid, choking smoke, the smell of burning diesel and ionized air. The force of the impact was so tremendous that the ship, the size of a small city, lurched on the wave, its deck immediately tilting at an unnatural angle. Gravity, until now an ally, became a merciless enemy. Everything not bolted down turned into a lethal projectile. Poon Lim was hurled against a wall with such force that every breath was driven from his lungs and dark spots appeared before his eyes. The ringing in his ears momentarily drowned out the screams of the wounded and terrified sailors, and the only thing his senses registered was a pulsing pain and total, overwhelming disorientation. The aftermath of the explosion inside the hull resembled a descent into Dante's Inferno.
When Poon Lim regained a fragment of consciousness, he realized that the corridors, which moments ago had gleamed with cleanliness, now looked like scenes from the worst nightmare. Emergency lights flickered spasmodically, throwing ghostly, dancing shadows on the walls that amplified the sense of chaos. From every direction came cries, desperate, pain-filled calls for help, drowning beneath the powerful, hollow roar of water forcing its way into the hall. SS Ben Lamond was dying, and its agony was swift and brutal. The floor beneath the steward's feet was plunging downward at terrifying speed, forcing him into a desperate struggle to maintain his balance. Hot steam jetted from ruptured pipes, scalding his skin, while thick smoke reduced visibility to only a few feet. Fear, primal and paralyzing, gripped him by the throat, but the survival instinct proved stronger. Without thought, driven by pure adrenaline, he began fighting his way toward the outer deck. Every step was a battle against gravity and obstacles, crushed doors, twisted pipes, and the bodies of those who had been less fortunate. Time flowed at an unnatural pace, seconds stretching like hours as the mighty ship sank deeper with every passing moment. Poon knew there was no time for lifeboats, no time for organization. The only chance of salvation was to escape this steel tomb before it dragged him down into the darkness. Before he could fully grasp the magnitude of the catastrophe, the force of another jolt, combined with the dramatic listing of the sinking giant, hurled him into the air. The world spun in a kaleidoscope of blue sky, black smoke, and gray steel. The fall lasted only a fraction of a second, yet in Poon Lim's mind it registered as an infinite, terrifying pause. The wind whistled in his ears as he plunged toward the foaming waves. The impact with the water surface was like colliding with a concrete wall. The icy embrace of the South Atlantic instantly expelled the remaining air from his lungs. The water, heavy and relentless, swallowed him in the blink of an eye, pulling him down into the murky deep. The sounds of the explosion and the screaming on the surface were abruptly cut off, replaced by an eerie underwater silence broken only by the muffled rumbling of the ship compartments imploding. The darkness beneath the water was almost palpable. Poon Lim, surrounded by the icy abyss, began fighting instinctively, pumping his arms and legs in a desperate bid to reach the light. The life jacket he wore became his only ally, pulling him upward with all its strength. His lungs burned for lack of oxygen, and his heart pounded in his chest like a caged bird gone mad. The struggle beneath the water was a silent, desperate dance with death, where every movement cost him the last of his precious energy. When he finally broke the surface, his first breath was a rasping, painful gasp of air that tasted not only of life-giving oxygen, but of death, decay, and toxic chemicals. Instead of clean sea breeze, his mouth filled with the vile, thick taste of fuel oil. The surface of the ocean around him was no longer a blue expanse. It had become a toxic, black soup of diesel fuel, splintered planks, shreds of insulation, and fragments of the ship equipment. The oil coated everything in a thin, slippery layer, stinging his eyes and clogging his nostrils. Poon Lim, coughing and spitting black slime, struggled to keep his head above water, blinking painfully through oil-smeared eyelids. The sight that met his eyes was shattering in its tragic grandeur. SS Ben Lomond, once mighty and proud, now raised its bow toward the heavens like a titan sinking in despair. The piercing, grinding, and groaning of splitting steel carried across the water as pressure crushed its innards. Poon's terror reached its zenith when he realized that the enormous mass of the sinking ship was creating a powerful suction vortex, drawing everything in its vicinity down with inexorable force. With desperate madness, he began paddling his arms, trying to swim as far as possible from the dying colossus, to avoid being pulled into the same watery grave.
When SS Ben Lomond finally disappeared beneath the waves, leaving behind only enormous air bubbles and a swirling oil slick, an eerie, sudden silence fell over the ocean. That silence was louder and more terrifying than any explosion. The sounds of catastrophe ceased, and in their place returned the indifferent, monotonous murmur of the waves. Here and there, in the distance, Poon could still hear the fading cries of other sailors, calls in different languages that sounded like desperate laments cast into the void. But with each passing minute, those voices grew fainter, more infrequent, until at last they fell silent entirely, swallowed by the boundless abyss. Poon Lim was alone. Surrounding him was an expanse of water stretching to the horizon in every direction. The sky, just moments ago clear, now seemed oppressive in its vast, empty space. The Chinese steward drifted in that gigantic space, a microscopic speck on the surface of an unimaginably vast and hostile organism. The life jacket, though it kept him afloat, offered no sense of safety in the face of absolute isolation. The awareness that several kilometers of dark abyss stretched beneath his feet induced nausea. Time lost its meaning. All that mattered was surviving the next wave, keeping his head above water, and battling the mounting panic that threatened to overwhelm all rational thought.
For 2 infinitely long, agonizing hours, Poon Lim fought a seemingly hopeless battle for survival in that watery hell. Physical exhaustion advanced at an alarming rate. The seawater and toxic oil ate into his skin, causing a burning pain that intensified with every movement. The waves, at first seeming nothing more than a rhythmic swell, now resembled blows delivered by an invisible opponent, relentlessly flooding his face and making it difficult to breathe. The ocean chill, initially refreshing, began inexorably sapping his vital warmth. Hypothermia crept in slowly, first paralyzing the fingers of his hands and feet, then crawling along his limbs toward his heart. His muscles shook in uncontrolled spasms, refusing to obey. The exhaustion was so overwhelming that the desire to close his eyes and surrender to the depths became almost irresistible. The psychological weight of his situation broke his spirit just as effectively as the cold destroyed his body. Fear of sharks, fear of drowning from exhaustion, fear that no one would ever learn his fate, all of it swirled in his mind like a dark tornado. In those moments of deepest despair, when darkness began to cloud his vision, the boundary between waking and hallucination began to dangerously blur. And it was precisely in this moment of ultimate crisis, when dark thoughts of surrender began to dominate, that a shape materialized atop a distant wave. At first, Poon dismissed it as a cruel illusion, a mirage born of exhaustion and despair. He blinked heavily, trying to wipe from his eyes the mixture of salt water and oil that burned like acid. The shape vanished into a wave trough, only to reappear on its crest moments later, clearer, more solid, tangible. It was not a U-boat, which he subconsciously feared, nor a useless piece of wreckage. It was a raft, a small wooden platform, a square scrap of salvation drifting in the middle of nowhere. The sight acted on his depleted body like a powerful injection of the purest adrenaline. His heart, moments ago beating sluggishly, suddenly surged, pumping the last reserves of energy into his failing muscles. A spark of hope, small and fragile, blazed to life in his soul, driving out the paralyzing fear. Poon Lim began to swim. Every stroke of his arm through the water was a monumental effort, a battle against his own weakness, against the weight of clothing saturated with water and oil, against the merciless ocean currents that seemed to push him back from his goal.
The distance separating him from the raft seemed vast from the perspective of the waves, and every meter gained cost him an unimaginable expenditure of strength. He swam driven solely by the primal instinct for survival, knowing this was his one last chance at life. Reaching the raft did not signal the end of his ordeal, but the beginning of a new, equally desperate struggle. When his fingers finally brushed the rough, waterlogged wood, he felt a relief that was immediately replaced by the realization of his own powerlessness. The raft flotation drums were slick with oil and algae, and his hands had no strength to grip firmly. He tried to haul himself up onto the platform, but his arms were like lead, and his body, heavy with water, refused to cooperate. He slid back into the ocean, swallowing water. Panic struck with redoubled force. He could not die now, not when salvation was literally within reach. He let out an animal cry, pouring into it all the determination, pain, and fear that had accumulated since the moment of the explosion. He braced his foot against a safety line, dug his fingernails into the splintered wooden edge, and in one convulsive spasm of effort threw the upper half of his torso over the side. He lay like that for a long moment, half submerged, breathing hard, while waves slapped against his legs. Piece by piece, like an evolutionary ancestor crawling from the ocean onto land, he dragged the rest of his aching body onto the raft. He collapsed face down on the hard planks, and the sensation of rough wood scraping his cheek felt like the most wonderful thing he had ever experienced. He was safe from the abyss, at least for this moment.
When his breathing finally steadied and the dark spots faded from his vision, Poon Lim rose to a seated position and began carefully examining his new refuge. The raft was a primitive 8-foot square construction, cobbled together from solid though battered wooden beams, buoyed by brass floats. It had no roof, no rudder, and no means of propulsion. It was nothing more than a tiny island floating on the waves in the heart of the most inhospitable environment on earth. Every movement of the swell caused it to pitch violently, creaking in protest as though it might fall apart at any moment. But in this moment, in this immensity of emptiness, it was his entire world, a kingdom in which he was the sole subject and sovereign. The shift in perspective was striking. Moments ago, his primary concern had been immediate drowning. Now, seated on wooden planks, he faced a completely new, long-term threat. The absence of shelter from the scorching sun and freezing wind, the lack of reliable food and fresh water, all of this presented itself as a slow death sentence, delayed only by a few days. The 8-by-8-foot space was becoming a prison surrounded by the highest possible walls, an infinite ocean. Nevertheless, the sensation of solid support beneath his aching body allowed his mind to return to rational, analytical thinking.
A thorough search of the raft yielded a discovery that would determine his further fate. In one corner, secured with sturdy straps, sat a small metal container. Poon approached it with his heart hammering, knowing the contents of this box would decide his life or death. With hands trembling from cold and emotion, he opened the rusting latches. When the lid sprang open, he found before him a makeshift yet invaluable emergency kit. Inside were several tins of hardened ship biscuits, a small tin pitcher containing life-sustaining fresh water, a few squares of military chocolate, and a heavy metal flashlight. In any other context, these items would have seemed trivial, almost pitiful. Here, however, at the center of nothing, they were relics of the highest importance. Poon touched each item gently, with reverential awe.
The tin of biscuits felt heavy, carrying the promise of survival. He raised the water pitcher to his ear and shook it gently. The sound of liquid inside was the most beautiful music he had ever heard, a signal that his body had a chance to function for another few days. The bars of chocolate wrapped in paper symbolized concentrated energy, and the flashlight offered the illusion of control over the approaching darkness. This modest equipment, carefully calculated by Navy engineers for a short wait for rescue, now had to last for an indeterminate length of time. While Poon took stock of his meager provisions, the sun began moving toward the western horizon, setting in motion a spectacle of color that in another situation would have taken his breath away, but now merely heralded the arrival of a nightmare. The sky took on hues reminiscent to frames from a classic Kodachrome film, deep, almost unnatural shades of violet and crimson interwoven with stormy leaden grays. The ocean shifted from a blue mirror to an indigo, and then a pitch-black abyss. Shadows cast by the raft edges stretched into infinity, growing sharp and high contrast against the fading light. With the sunset, the air temperature dropped drastically, and a moist wind began beating mercilessly against the castaway's wet body. Dusk brought with it a complete change of atmosphere. What by day had seemed a broad open space transformed by night into a claustrophobic darkness in which every sound grew to the proportions of a mortal threat. The flashlight he held in his hand remained switched off. Instinct told him to conserve the batteries, and so the darkness swallowed him completely, leaving only the pale light of stars that began slowly piercing the sky above.
In that growing darkness, in a solitude so deep it was physically painful, the final psychological transformation of Poon Lim took place. Sitting on the wet planks with his arms wrapped around his knees in an attempt to preserve the last of his warmth, he understood that the man he had been that very morning had ceased to exist. The steward of SS Ben Lomond, who had tended to the order and comfort of others, had perished in the flames and waters of the Atlantic. In his place was born a castaway, a primal being whose sole purpose, sole law, and sole obligation was to remain alive at any cost. He stripped himself of memories of a warm bunk, of routine, of the safe world on land, because such thoughts in his current situation were poison that could weaken his resolve. He accepted the brutal reality. There was no one who could come to his aid, no radio, no distress signal. There was only him, the wooden platform, and the vast, indifferent universe. That awareness, though terrifying, brought with it also a strange sense of crystalline clarity. His existence had been reduced to absolute fundamentals, where every drop of water, every calorie, and every second of life had taken on ultimate value.
The first night on the raft was a test of the limits of human endurance. Waves struck the underside of the platform with a hollow booming that sounded like the footsteps of some great sea creature circling its prey. Water occasionally sloshed over the edges, icily reminding him of the ocean proximity. Every creak of the wood triggered an adrenaline surge, heightening the fear that the raft would at last yield to the destructive force of the elements. The cold seeped deep into his bones, causing tremors so violent that his entire back and shoulders ached. In the darkness, his imagination worked at full capacity, feeding his fear of creatures lurking beneath the thin layer of planks, sharks whose presence in these waters was a certainty. He gripped the metal flashlight like a talisman, drawing from its hard shape a false sense of security. With eyes closed, he tried to concentrate on the rhythm of his own breathing, ignoring the terrifying, alien sounds of the oceanic night. Sounds like the moaning of the drowned, wind wailing in the void, and the cracking of breaking glaciers. Time ceased to flow linearly, stretching every minute into an eternity of torment and wakefulness. When at last a pale gray ribbon of dawn began to appear on the eastern horizon, Poon Lim was exhausted, but still alive. The first rays of sunlight, slowly breaking through the morning mist, revealed the immensity of his solitude, yet at the same time brought a small measure of life-giving warmth. He sat in the middle of emptiness, a small, shivering man on a wooden raft that from this perspective seemed absurdly fragile against the boundless elements. Gazing at the broad, now calm ocean, he slowly accepted his new reality. The explosion, the fire, the sinking ship, and the cries of his shipmates were already nothing but yesterday nightmare. Before him stretched a new day, the first of many days of uncertainty and unimaginable hardship. With only a few biscuits, a little water, a piece of chocolate, and an indomitable will to survive forged in fire and icy water, he prepared for his struggle with the greatest and most merciless of adversaries, nature itself, and his own weakness. On those 8 square feet of wood, beneath the indifferent eye of the cosmos, the castaway Poon Lim began his epic odyssey, determined not to become another forgotten victim swallowed by the void.
Chapter 2. The Tyranny of the Sun. The dawn of the first true day of his absolute isolation broke not with the gentle, forgiving promise of morning, but with the brutal, blinding declaration of an unyielding solar regime that would soon become his primary tormentor. The horizon, a razor-sharp demarcation line between the deep, bruised indigo of the churning Atlantic and the rapidly lightening, stormy grays of the firmament, seemed to stretch out into a terrifying infinity, emphasizing the microscopic insignificance of his existence. The raft, a rudimentary construction of lashed wood that groaned and flexed with every undulating movement of the swell, was a tiny geometric anomaly trapped within the organic primordial chaos of the endless sea. As the sun breached the edge of the world, its light did not merely illuminate the ocean, it ignited it, transforming the water into a shimmering, shifting tapestry of deep ocean blues that perfectly mirrored the saturated, dramatic contrast of a 1940s Kodachrome photograph. The cinematic quality of the light cast harsh, elongated shadows across the sun-bleached wood of his fragile sanctuary, highlighting every knot, every splinter, and every frayed edge of rope with hyper-realistic intensity. This was his new reality, a vast, empty stage where the performance was one of silent endurance, and the audience consisted entirely of the apathetic, rolling waves that possessed neither memory nor mercy. He sat perfectly still amidst this breathtaking and terrifying beauty, feeling the transition from the profound shock of the shipwreck to the cold, creeping, and infinitely heavier dread of solitary confinement on the open ocean.
The rationing of his meager, finite provisions immediately became a sacred, agonizing ritual, a desperate, high-stakes mathematics of survival, where every microscopic fraction of a crumb held the gravitational weight of another hour of biological existence. He possessed a single, battered square metal tin that housed the entirety of his solid sustenance, a vessel that he treated with the reverence of a holy relic. The mechanical action of prying open the lid, accompanied by the dry, metallic scrape that seemed deafening against the relentless whisper of the wind, released the faint, stale scent of baked flour, an aroma that triggered an overwhelming, almost violent biological response within his starving form. His weathered, sun-baked hands, already beginning to show the unmistakable signs of profound dehydration and exposure, trembled slightly as he reached inside to retrieve a single hard-tack biscuit. The visual framing of this moment was stark and dramatic, his darkened, calloused skin contrasting sharply against the bright, reflective glare of the surrounding water and the pale, dusty surface of the biscuit. He did not eat it. Rather, he performed a microscopic surgery upon it, carefully, agonizingly dividing the small disc into even smaller fragments, forcing his mind to overrule the screaming demands of his stomach. The discipline required to place a singular, tiny piece onto his tongue to let it dissolve slowly rather than immediately swallowing it whole required a supreme expenditure of psychological willpower, leaving him entirely exhausted by the sheer effort of denying his own desperate hunger. As the sun continued its inexorable ascent, reaching its undisputed zenith, it rapidly transformed from a mere celestial illuminator into a sentient, malicious entity, a relentless tormentor that bathed the raft in an incandescent, inescapable glare that felt physically heavy upon his shoulders. The atmospheric grays of the morning were completely burned away, leaving a naked, cloudless expanse of hostile blue that offered absolutely no refuge, no shield from the punishing ultraviolet radiation raining down upon him. The heat radiating off the sun-bleached wood of the deck created a wavering, localized mirage, a localized inferno that baked the moisture directly out of his pores, leaving behind microscopic, stinging crystals of ocean salt that quickly dried into sharp, abrasive crusts. These crystalline formations chafed violently against his damp, ragged clothing with every microscopic movement of his body, creating dozens of small, weeping sores that burned with a localized, fiery intensity. The glare reflecting off the undulating surface of the ocean acted as a million moving mirrors, attacking his retinas with blinding flashes of pure white light that forced him to keep his eyes narrowed to mere slits, his vision swimming with dark, floating afterimages. The physical agony of the heat was absolute, an enveloping, suffocating blanket of thermal misery that threatened to boil the very blood in his veins, turning the once comforting warmth of the sun into an instrument of profound, inescapable torture.
The act of keeping watch over the vast emptiness became an obsessive, self-destructive compulsion, a desperate, sweeping scan of the 360-degree prison wall that constituted the uninterrupted horizon, driven by the fading embers of a hope he could not entirely abandon. He stared out across the majestic, terrifying expanse of deep ocean blues, his eyes straining against the punishing glare, actively searching for the faintest geometric irregularity that might signal the silhouette of a passing ship. The blistering heat conspired with his exhausted mind to produce cruel, tantalizing optical illusions, heat shimmers that distorted the crisp line where the sky met the water, conjuring phantom smokestacks and ghostly masts from the peaks of distant white-capped waves. His heart would forcefully accelerate in his chest, a sudden, painful surge of adrenaline flooding his system as he stared intently at the mirage, praying with every fiber of his being that the apparition would solidify into the steel hull of salvation. The inevitable, crushing realization that the shape was merely another shifting wave, that the illusion had dissolved back into the meaningless, chaotic geometry of the sea, delivered a psychological blow that felt like a physical strike to his sternum. The sheer, overwhelming scale of the Earth's curvature became a terrifying concept, the terrifying understanding that he was hidden in a vast valley of water, entirely invisible to the world, a forgotten speck of biology, slowly withering away beneath an apathetic sky. When the tyrannical sun finally capitulated to the rotation of the earth, plunging below the jagged edge of the world, it did not bring the sweet relief he anticipated. Rather, it ushered in a radically different, arguably more profound terror, the deep, bone-chilling cold of the open ocean night. The transition was visually spectacular, a Kodachrome sunset that painted the firmament in violent streaks of deep, bruised purples, fiery, apocalyptic oranges, and bloody reds, a fleeting masterpiece of light that rapidly bled away into an absolute suffocating pitch black. The immediate, precipitous drop in temperature was physically shocking, the searing heat of the day instantly replaced by a damp, penetrating chill that bypassed his flesh and settled deep within his aching bones, triggering violent, uncontrollable shivering. The loss of visual input in the profound darkness induced a state of forced sensory deprivation, fundamentally altering his perception of his environment and dramatically amplifying the terrifying auditory landscape of his isolation. He could hear the heavy rhythmic slapping of the cold water against the hollow wooden pontoon structures beneath him, and the sinister, unidentifiable splashes of large, unseen leviathans moving through the ink-black depths just inches below his fragile platform. The darkness brought with it a crushing, suffocating solitude that felt physically heavier than the atmospheric pressure of the day, an existential dread that wrapped around his throat and whispered that he was entirely alone, forgotten by God and man, suspended over an abyss of certain death.
Time itself gradually lost all conventional meaning, stretching, bending, and distorting until the individual days completely blurred into a singular, agonizingly monotonous cycle of burning, relentless light and freezing, terrifying darkness. The raft, an incredibly small geometric square of lashed wood and canvas floating in an infinite void, ceased to be merely a vessel and systematically became his entire enclosed universe, the absolute limit of his physical reality. With nothing else to occupy his mind, his awareness shrank to encompass the hyper-realistic details of his immediate surroundings. He learned the specific pitch and timbre of every individual creak the wood made as it flexed against the waves. He memorized the precise location of every splinter, every rusted nailhead, every complex knot in the rough, sun-bleached wood, tracing the grain with his cracked fingertips until the tactile sensation was burned permanently into his memory. This obsessive focus on the microscopic architecture of his survival craft was a desperate defense mechanism, a profound psychological attempt to maintain control over a microscopic fraction of a universe where he was otherwise entirely powerless. The sensory deprivation of the vast, unchanging ocean forced his mind to hyperfixate on these minuscule details, accelerating his perception of time stagnation, making every passing hour feel like an entire agonizing decade of solitary confinement. Thirst, however, was a distinct, sharp, and constantly escalating agony that easily cut through the monotonous blur of his existence, a constant, screaming biological demand from his cellular structure that he was forced to systematically and cruelly deny. The physical sensation of severe dehydration was entirely overwhelming. His mouth felt as though it had been packed with dry, coarse sand, his tongue swelling into a heavy, useless block of wood that scraped painfully against the roof of his palate. The daily ritual of consuming his water ration was a masterclass in agonizing self-restraint. He would carefully unscrew the cap of the heavy water jug, measuring out an incredibly small, almost insulting volume of the precious stale liquid. He did not swallow it immediately. Instead, he held the tepid, metallic-tasting water in his mouth, violently swishing it around to coat his desperate, dry mucous membranes, allowing the moisture to be absorbed directly through his gums. The ultimate, inevitable act of swallowing was a moment of profound, painful ecstasy, followed less than a minute later by the immediate, cruel resurgence of the exact same agonizing thirst, as if the water had instantly evaporated within his chest. The steady, undeniable dwindling of the water level within the jug, visually confirmed each day by the lowering waterline, was a slow-motion horror story, a constant, terrifying reminder that his biological clock was audibly ticking down to zero.
The initial fragile comfort provided by his limited supplies rapidly and inevitably curdled into a gnawing, pervasive anxiety as he was forced to bear constant witness to their steady, irreversible, and mathematical diminishment. Each time he carefully opened the metal biscuit tin or tipped the heavy water jug, the psychological paradigm dramatically shifted. These items were no longer his lifeline, but rather an hourglass rapidly running out of sand, a terrifying countdown to absolute destitution. The emotional chain within his mind was clear and devastating. The fading, desperate hope of an immediate, miraculous rescue gradually gave way to a growing, heavy dread as the physical volume of his provisions shrank before his very eyes. He constantly ran the terrifying calculations in his head, dividing the remaining crumbs and drops by the days, the math painting a bleak, inescapable picture of the exact moment when the last barrier between himself and starvation would finally collapse. The sheer psychological weight of this impending doom rested heavily upon his shoulders, a dark, oppressive cloud that obscured any remaining rays of optimism, transforming the raft from a temporary lifeboat into a slow-floating execution chamber. The safety net that the provisions represented was systematically fraying, strand by strand, and the realization that he would soon be an absolute free-fall toward an agonizing death was a terrifying psychological burden that threatened to completely crush his spirit. To aggressively stave off the encroaching, heavy silence that constantly threatened to consume his mind entirely and drag him into the abyss of madness, he began to actively vocalize his internal thoughts, forcefully projecting his voice into the vast emptiness. He would speak out loud, the sound of his own voice striking him as profoundly foreign, raspy, and weak, instantly swallowed by the immense apathetic acoustic void of the open ocean wind and the rolling indifferent waves. He forcefully engaged in complex, multi-sided arguments with himself concerning the strict management of the remaining rations, actively fracturing his psyche into the distinct roles of a stern commander and a desperate begging subordinate in a desperate bid to simulate human companionship. He stubbornly recited every memory of his distant home he could conjure, meticulously detailing the layout of streets, the specific smells of local food stalls, the cacophony of the shipyard, frantically trying to anchor his mind to his fading humanity. These vocal exercises were frequently punctuated by terrifying, sudden moments of hyper-lucidity, where the manufactured illusion of conversation instantly shattered, leaving him staring at the empty horizon, acutely aware that he was merely a lone, dying man talking to an uncaring ocean. The profound fear of permanent psychological fracturing, of losing his mind long before his body finally surrendered to the elements, became a terror equal to the agonizing physical realities of starvation and severe debilitating dehydration.
A sudden, sharp, and intensely dramatic break in the crushing visual monotony occurred on the scorching afternoon of the 7th day, arriving gracefully in the form of a lone seabird, a pristine, blindingly white anomaly against the oppressive canvas of the blue sky. The sudden appearance of this living creature triggered a massive, painful surge of pure adrenaline and desperate, unadulterated hope within his exhausted system, entirely shattering the lethargic trance of his slow deterioration. He forcefully dragged himself to an upright position, his cracked, bleeding lips forming desperate, hoarse words as he actively shouted at the avian visitor, pleading with it, irrationally projecting complex human emotions and the promise of salvation onto its simple, feathered form. The bird represented everything he had lost: freedom, mobility, life, and the tantalizing, agonizing possibility that land, and therefore survival, existed somewhere just beyond the cruel, curving horizon that trapped him. Yet the creature remained utterly indifferent to his desperate performance, circling the raft with an effortless, graceful mastery of the wind currents, a stark, insulting contrast to his own trapped, slowly dying state upon the decaying wooden planks. The agonizing, heartbreaking moment the bird finally banked sharply away, catching a thermal draft and rapidly shrinking into an invisible speck in the distance, entirely stripped him of his remaining false hope, leaving the sky feeling profoundly emptier and more hostile than it had ever been before. The physical degradation of his body rapidly became a macabre, inescapable spectacle, a slow-motion, hyper-realistic dismantling of his biological form that he was forced to observe daily with a detached, deeply morbid fascination. The cinematic, high-contrast lighting of the sun mercilessly exposed the dramatic changes. His once sturdy frame was rapidly consuming its own muscle mass, causing his collarbones and ribs to protrude sharply against his tightening, sun-baked skin. The terrible sunburns covering his shoulders and arms had blistered, popped, and violently peeled multiple times, creating a raw, highly textured mosaic of damaged flesh that contrasted starkly against the sun-bleached, deeply grained wood of the raft's deck. The heavy accumulation of ocean salt, combined with the constant grinding friction of his damp clothing, had generated deep, weeping sores at every joint and point of contact, ensuring that absolutely every physical movement, no matter how small, was accompanied by a sharp, stinging agony. His eyes, once bright and observant, were now sunken deep into dark, bruised hollows, possessing a haunted, desperate expression that entirely encapsulated the profound exhaustion of his ongoing, agonizing struggle against the vast, unrelenting elements. This visceral, highly detailed reality of starvation and severe exposure, depicted in the harsh, dramatic chiaroscuro lighting of his marine environment, made him appear as a tragic figure in a Renaissance painting, a solitary martyr suffering upon an altar of lashed wood.
The dreaded, inevitable Gay finally manifested, arriving without any grand fanfare but carrying the immense, crushing gravitational weight of a collapsing star. The specific, terrifying day he reached his trembling hand into the metal tin and retrieved the very last biscuit. The entire ceremony of consuming this final piece of sustenance was performed with a painful, hyper-focused intensity. He meticulously brushed the literal microscopic dust from the bottom corners of the rusted tin, ensuring absolutely nothing was left behind. He placed the hard, stale fragment upon his dry tongue, acutely aware that this was the absolute termination of his solid food, experiencing a complex, overwhelming cascade of emotions, ranging from profound grief to a cold, paralyzing terror. He chewed the morsel with agonizing slowness, attempting to memorize the texture, the faint taste of wheat, the mechanical sensation of his jaw working, delaying the final, inevitable swallow for as long as his desperate biology would allow. When the swallow finally occurred, the psychological silence that immediately followed was profound and entirely deafening. The imaginary safety net had completely dissolved, and the terrifying countdown that had dominated his thoughts had finally, irrevocably reached absolute zero. There was absolutely nothing left to save, nothing left to ration, nothing left to manage. The comforting illusion of control provided by the provisions was entirely shattered, leaving him completely exposed to the harsh, unforgiving reality of his immense isolation. The parallel, equally devastating tragedy occurred shortly thereafter, directly beneath the merciless, blinding glare of the midday sun, when he reached out, lifted the water jug, and felt the terrifying hollow lack of inertia, the horrifying lightness of the empty vessel. He slowly, desperately tipped the jug completely vertical, craning his neck backward to catch the final warm, metallic-tasting drops that slowly gathered at the rim, letting them fall onto his cracked, bleeding lips like tears of a dying god. The profound, hollow thumping sound of the completely empty jug dropping heavily onto the resonant wooden deck of the raft echoed loudly, a stark auditory punctuation mark that perfectly symbolized the absolute end of his initial, meager supplies. This specific moment marked a terrifying, irrevocable turning point in his ordeal. The fragile, invisible tether connecting him to his past civilized life, to the concept of guaranteed survival, had been violently and completely severed by the dull thud of empty plastic. He stared intensely at the empty water jug and the completely hollow biscuit tin, two artifacts of a bygone era, deeply understanding that from this precise moment forward, his continued existence would not be a matter of passive waiting, but of violent, active struggle. He was now entirely, terrifyingly at the absolute mercy of the vast, apathetic elements, forced to deeply accept that the ocean, his constant companion and tormentor, was now the sole arbiter of his life and his imminent death.
The first terrifying night following the absolute exhaustion of his provisions descended upon the raft not merely as an expected absence of light, but as a heavy, suffocating shroud of absolute, unadulterated, and crushing despair. The complex emotional chain that had slowly built over the previous days finally reached its ultimate devastating culmination. The fading hope and growing dread violently exploded into a state of pure, paralyzed desperation that gripped his chest like a physical vice. The terrible panic attacks came in violent, unpredictable waves, causing him to hyperventilate the cold, salty air, his violently shivering body racked by a combination of profound physical hypothermia and absolute, overwhelming existential terror. He gazed intensely into the deep, stormy grays and pitch blacks of the rolling ocean, seeing perfectly reflected within the abyss the completely fractured, deeply terrified state of his own soul, entirely stripped of its defensive illusions. The overwhelming, seductive temptation to simply surrender, to roll his exhausted body over the rough edge of the wood and let the dark, freezing water quickly and mercifully take him, became a massive, almost irresistible psychological force in the deep darkness. He was entirely alone, completely unaided, and utterly devoid of resources. The safety net had completely dissolved into the dark ocean, leaving him suspended over the absolute certainty of his own demise, entirely consumed by the profound darkness of his own solitary confinement. Yet, slowly, from the absolute crushing nadir of his profound despair, a cold, hard, and terrifyingly clear psychological resolve began to gradually crystallize as the faint, grayish dawn of a new, terrifying era slowly broke across the uninterrupted horizon. The profound internal transition was absolute and irreversible. His deep despair hardened into a sharp, jagged determination, a primal realization that if he were to somehow continue living, he must fundamentally alter his entire approach to this hostile environment. He deeply understood that he could no longer afford to be a passive passenger on this floating piece of debris, merely waiting for an entirely hypothetical rescue that the immense, uncaring ocean had absolutely no intention of delivering. He had to become an active, ruthless predator. He must look at the terrifying, endless expanse of the ocean not merely as a vast, watery graveyard waiting to claim him, but as a massive, brutal, and challenging larder. The definitive end of his agonizing waiting marked the terrifying, violent beginning of his active, relentless struggle for survival. He wiped the dried salt from his deeply sunken eyes, stared defiantly into the blinding glare of the rising sun, and silently prepared to fight the entire ocean.
Chapter 3. Genialny rozbitek.
The ominous silence of the ocean had never been so deafening as in the moment when Poon Lim grasped the brutal final truth of his situation. The last crumbs of the ship biscuits, which he had rationed out with reverent care over the preceding weeks, were gone, leaving behind only a phantom taste on his cracked and bleeding lips. The empty metal tins that had held his rations, heated to a fierce intensity by the merciless equatorial sun, lay on the raft deck like silent monuments to his approaching doom.
Every glance at those sun-scorched, rust-edged containers was like a blow from a hammer, reminding him that the time for passive waiting was irreversibly over. The boundless, azure desert of surrounding water, which in the first days had seemed a road toward salvation, now appeared as a vast liquid grave. Salt settled on his eyelashes, stinging his eyes and reminding him of the slow mummification being visited upon his emaciated body. With each heartbeat that seemed to pump an ever-thickening waterless fluid through his veins, Poon Lim faced the most fundamental choice he had ever had to make: to surrender and let the ocean swallow him without a trace, or to awaken the primal survival instinct within himself and become something more than a victim of catastrophe. Desperation, that dark, suffocating feeling which had until now paralyzed his mind, began slowly transforming into a cold, calculating determination. He knew that if he could not find a way to obtain food and water, his days, perhaps even his hours, were numbered. He had to become an innovator in a world where there were no tools, no materials beyond those he could wrest from his tiny wooden prison. In his eyes, dulled by salt spray and exhaustion, a new spark kindled, the spark of a man who resolutely refuses death, and his mind began feverishly analyzing every smallest detail of his limited floating microcosm. His gaze, now sharp and searching like a predator cornered with nowhere to run, fell upon the useless, rusted electric flashlight that had formed part of the standard equipment of the life raft. The batteries had long since given up the ghost, and the device itself seemed nothing but dead weight, a mockery of the civilization that had left him here at the mercy of fate. Yet for a mind that had crossed the boundary of ordinary rational thinking and entered the realm of absolute necessity for survival, that metal tube was no longer a source of light, but a mine of invaluable raw materials. With hands trembling from weakness, yet guided by an unbreakable will, Poon Lim began the process of methodically dismantling the flashlight. Every movement cost him precious energy, but his fingers, covered in hardened blisters and open wounds from the omnipresent, corrosive salt water, worked with almost surgical precision.
Having the raw, unworked material was, however, only the beginning of an exhausting craftsman process of creation. A piece of rusted iron, though hard and solid, was in its current blunt shape utterly useless against the agile, slippery creatures inhabiting the ocean. It had to be transformed into a precise instrument of killing, a sharp, lethal blade that would become a proper fishhook. Poon Lim, his face set in a grimace of intense concentration, sat at the very edge of the raft, allowing the dramatic chiaroscuro cast by the afternoon sun lowering in the sky to carve the hollows of his sunken, fat-free cheeks and accentuate the deep wrinkles on his sun-scorched brow. He found the roughest, hardest section of the wooden deck edge, where sea salt had been crystallizing month after month, layer upon layer, creating a natural, highly abrasive surface resembling coarse sandpaper. The monotonous, bone-chilling, physically exhausting process of bending and sharpening the recovered metal began. He pressed the thick nail against the mineralized wood with all the strength remaining to him, striving to give it the proper, deadly curve, praying inwardly with all his might that the iron, brittle with age and rust, would not break at the decisive moment and destroy his only chance of rescue. Then came the hours-long, painstaking sharpening. The sound of hard metal scraping against the salt-hardened wood was sharp, piercing, and unpleasant, vibrating through his weakened body right to the bone, but to the desperate Poon it was the most beautiful symphony of dawning hope. Hour after hour, in a slow, hypnotic rhythm, he drew the blunt tip of the nail across his improvised wooden whetstone. Dense sweat poured in waves down his dirty face, stinging his bloodshot eyes, and his palms became covered with new, painful blisters that burst repeatedly, staining the pale wood a rusty, blood-red color.
In that monotonous process, there was absolutely no room for impatience or haste. He had to work out a perfectly sharp point that would effortlessly penetrate the hard, armored scales of fish and create a tiny, precise barb that would effectively prevent their escape from the trap. When at last, after many hours of physically punishing work, he raised his handiwork to the sharp sun to carefully examine the achieved profile and edge, a shadow of a genuine smile appeared on his scorched, cracking lips. That primitive, rough but murderously sharp hook was in his eyes a true masterpiece of survival engineering, the ultimate triumph of human will and creativity over the absolute crushing hopelessness of the dead ocean surrounding him.
He quickly understood that blind, instinctive determination, devoid of deep knowledge of the environment, was a direct road to nowhere and would ultimately lead to his destruction. Instead of mindlessly casting his improvised line over and over and naively counting on any chance stroke of luck, Poon Lim became a supremely attentive student of the boundless ocean, a quiet, invisible observer of the aquatic microcosm that had formed and flourished directly around his slowly rotting wooden raft as time passed. He spent entire long days motionless, lying on his stomach on the planks heated to a fierce intensity, his heavy head hanging dangerously close just above the swaying water surface, gazing ceaselessly into the hypnotizing, deep, almost impenetrable blackness and blue of the marine abyss. His small raft, the only drifting object casting a precious cool shadow on the great open ocean, magically drew small marine organisms from all directions, creatures desperately seeking safe shelter from the burning equatorial sun and the constant attacks of far larger oceanic predators. Poon began at last to perceive very subtle, hidden patterns in their daily behavior, the natural rhythm of their synchronized movements dictated by the changing hours of the day, the drastic fluctuations in surface water temperature, and the cyclical flow of underwater ocean currents. He learned to unfailingly recognize the small, elongated shadows of agile fish darting in schools just beneath the calm surface, and those far deeper, darker, more ominous silhouettes of great predators lazily circling at the very limit of optical visibility, waiting for their moment. He carefully observed how the smallest fish reacted to microscopic scraps tossed into the water, how precisely they examined potential drifting food before their lightning-fast strike and capture, and how incredibly quickly they could change direction the moment they sensed the slightest threat. This deep empirical knowledge, gained at the enormous cost of mounting hunger and the painful burning sunburn covering his back, was the absolute key to his ultimate fishing success. He finally understood that his movements on the raft planks had to be extremely slow, almost imperceptible, and as fluid as possible, so as not to startle his sensitive prey with impact micro-vibrations easily transmitted through the hard wood directly into the resonating water. With surgical precision, he adjusted the final thickness of his braided hemp line and the optimal angle of curvature of the hook fashioned from a rusted nail, optimizing his primitive tackle based solely on countless hours of observation. From a defenseless victim cruelly left at the mercy of a pitiless fate, he was very slowly transforming into a coldly calculating sea hunter who was beginning to understand the complex language of his boundless liquid prison.
Yet this euphoric joy and the momentary calm brought by the first satisfying meal of raw fish was, unfortunately, terrifyingly brief, instantly suppressed by the returning, brutally stark awareness of the hard physiological laws of long-term survival on the great salt ocean. The blood of the killed fish and the raw flesh consumed had indeed satisfied his raging hunger and provided only the minimal, critical amount of saving moisture, but it was absolutely insufficient to permanently arrest the progressive, systematic, and murderous dehydration of his entire organism caused by sun and wind. Without a constant, abundant, and reliable source of safe, fresh drinking water, his exhausted kidneys would soon cease to function entirely, and his weak, tormented mind would inevitably sink into dark, deadly hallucinations, leading ultimately to a painful agony. Poon Lim knew perfectly well, with cold logic, that he had to find an innovative solution to this burning problem with lightning speed, a solution equally brilliant and effective as the fishing one that had just allowed him to obtain his first food. His attentive, supremely focused gaze wandered once again across the very limited, cramped space of the wooden raft, slowly analyzing each and every available object, each flat surface, for its potential usefulness in the approaching new mission for life. And then his gaze stopped unexpectedly on the yellow, large canvas cover of his own completely destroyed life jacket, which lay carelessly tossed in a corner. The canvas material was very thick, heavily stiffened with accumulated dried sea salt, but, what was most important, it appeared waterproof to a degree entirely sufficient to retain on its broad surface any precious liquid. Looking high up into the boundless sky, where dark, threatening storm clouds were slowly gathering far on the horizon, leaden, powerful, and undoubtedly heavy with accumulated moisture, a bold, brilliant in its simplicity plan was born suddenly in his mind. He immediately understood that he absolutely could not, as before, simply lie and idly wait with his mouth open to the sky for the falling rain, wasting precious drops of fresh water that ran uselessly down his dirty face into the sea. To survive the coming weeks, he had to create by his own hands an efficient catching system, a large collecting surface that would allow him to store the maximum amount of fresh rainwater in the shortest possible time.
Chapter 4. The Devil and the Deep Blue Sea. Scarcely had the fragile routine of survival managed to put down weak roots in Poon Lim's tortured mind before the ocean, in its infinite and capricious indifference, decided to remind him of its absolute destructive power. The change did not come suddenly. It crept in with an almost sadistic slowness, manifesting through subtle, ominous modifications in the structure of the air and the quality of the daylight. The barometric pressure dropped so drastically that Poon Lim felt physical pain in his eardrums, and the air, until now saturated with the sharp scent of salt, became thick, sticky, and unnaturally heavy, smelling of metallic ozone and decay from the deep. The sky, usually mercilessly blue, began taking on hues reminiscent of an old festering wound, moving from dirty yellow to a deep violet darkness, recalling the texture and grain of early Kodachrome film, where colors seem almost oversaturated, yet simultaneously drained of life. The sunlight was smothered by a growing wall of clouds that piled up on the horizon like massive basalt mountains, devouring every hope of warmth. The wind, initially no more than a cool whisper, began building in force, transforming into a steady low roar that resonated in the castaway's chest. The ocean surface, which had until now rocked the raft with gentle indifference, began to ripple and churn, taking on a shade of such deep ink-like indigo that it appeared black. Each wave became sharper, more aggressive, striking the wooden timbers of the raft with mounting fury, as though testing the endurance of the improvised construction. Poon Lim, watching this transformation, felt his heart accelerate, and an icy shiver of primal terror wind its way up his spine, making him realize that his struggles so far had been merely a prelude to the true nightmare now approaching to consume his fragile existence in the boundless watery abyss. When the storm struck, there was nothing in it of human measure. It was a manifestation of pure, unbridled energy of nature that reduced the raft to the dimensions of a microscopic speck in the face of a cosmic cataclysm. The first of the monstrous waves that emerged from the darkness was so gigantic that it blocked the entire horizon, rising like a moving black wall whose crest was lost in the low-hanging leaden clouds. The water, piled to unimaginable heights, roared with a deafening crash, and the foam torn from its crest by the hurricane wind resembled a dense white blizzard.
The raft, lifted by a smaller preceding wave, found itself suddenly in the valley between two watery ridges, and Poon Lim had to tilt his head almost vertically upward to see the edge of the approaching aquatic leviathan.
Yet, as time passed and the burning pain in his stomach and parched mouth became unbearable, the paralyzing fear in Poon Lim's mind began undergoing a strange, alchemical transformation. In the face of the absolute certainty of death by starvation or in the jaws of sharks, the thin veneer of civilized man cracked and fell away, releasing something far older, darker, and infinitely more dangerous. Instead of cowering in a corner and waiting for the inevitable, he felt a cold, rational anger ignite in his chest, a primal animal fury that rejected the status of victim with absolute decisiveness. He looked at the circling beasts no longer with terror, but with dark, predatory calculation. In his mind, a brutal re-evaluation of roles had taken place. The sharks had ceased to be his tormentors and had become gigantic swimming storehouses of meat, protein, and fluid that he absolutely needed to survive. This was not a rational decision made in comfort, but a biological imperative, an explosion of adrenaline combined with a survival instinct so powerful it suppressed all fears of the adversary power. He decided that if he was to die, it would not happen passively. He would descend into their bloody, merciless world, engage them on their own terms, and either be torn apart or wrest his life from their very entrails, thereby becoming the greatest predator in this microscopic floating ecosphere. The preparations for the confrontation required absolute concentration and precision, all that his depleted organism could muster, for he knew he would have only one chance, and any error would result in swift death. Using the last remnants of bait that had miraculously survived in the cracks of the raft after the storm, he provisionally strengthened his thickest fishing line, ensuring that the improvised hook hammered from a nail was as sharp as possible. His true weapon, however, the only thing that could level the odds in hand-to-hand combat with a ton of muscle and teeth, was a large water jug which he half-filled with seawater, turning it into a powerful, heavy club of destructive potential. He positioned himself at the edge of the raft, planting his feet wide apart to maintain balance on the pitching wood, grasped the line in his left hand, and closed his right firmly around the handle of the heavy jug, raising it slightly in readiness to strike. The air seemed to thicken with tension as he dropped the bloodied bait into the water, deliberately striking the surface to draw the attention of the circling shadows. The sun scorched his bare, salt-encrusted back mercilessly, but he felt no heat, only the rhythmic beating of his own heart and the rush of blood in his ears. Chapter 5. Ghosts on the Horizon. The ocean was an immense, insatiable mirror in which only the infinite, merciless sky was reflected, creating a spherical cage of blue and white from which there was no physical or mental escape, and the weight of 133 days of uninterrupted, absolute solitude pressed down on Poon Lim with the force of a physical blow. Every hour spent on the sun-bleached, cracked wooden raft seemed to stretch into infinity, transforming time into a sticky, suffocating substance that coated his mind and body, slowly sucking from him the last remnants of human dignity and will to survive. The greatest battles he now had to fight on that watery desert were no longer clashes with raging elements, with massive waves the height of buildings or with the burning, skin-destroying sun, but dark, exhausting wars waged in the deepest recesses of his own mind. He fought desperately against the enveloping despair, against that quiet, seductive whisper telling him simply to slide off the edge of the raft and let the cool, dark depths of the ocean end his torment. The psychological cost of this relentless struggle was, however, unimaginably immense.
His mind, starved of any external stimulus, began consuming itself, creating illusions and distorting reality to such a degree that the thin line between salvation and madness grew more blurred with every passing day. Hope, which in the first days after the sinking of the ship had been his greatest ally and driving force, had now, after more than 4 months of drifting, undergone a terrifying mutation, becoming the cruelest form of psychological torture. With every sunrise it awoke anew in him, naive and bright, only to be brutally crushed with the arrival of each cool, indifferent night by the awareness that another day had passed without any sign of life, without a single sail on the horizon, leaving him with an emptiness so profound it seemed to devour his soul. Poon Lim body, once supple and full of life, now resembled a dry branch thrown ashore by a storm. His skin was burned mahogany, covered in painful burning ulcers from constant contact with salt water, and his bones jutted through a thin layer of muscle, living testament to his slow, methodical starvation. His lips were cracked and bleeding, his eyes sunken deep in their sockets, gleaming with an unnatural, feverish light, the look of someone who has peered behind the veil of reality and found there only absolute emptiness. Every movement on the raft required a titanic effort of will, forcing him to overcome paralyzing physical pain. But it was stillness that was worst of all. In moments of dead calm at sea, when the wind died entirely and the ocean surface became smooth as glass, Poon Lim felt like an insect trapped in amber, frozen in time and space, condemned to an eternal existence in agony.
Chapter 6. The Scent of Land. The sound of the American aircraft engines, which moments ago had constituted a roaring promise of salvation, slowly dissolved into the boundless, indifferent silence of the open ocean, and with it fled the last remnants of Poon Lim's vital energy, leaving behind only a crushing, absolute emptiness. This was not ordinary disappointment. It was the final, brutal breaking of the spirit, the shattering of some invisible core that had kept him alive for over 100 days in defiance of all the laws of physics and biology. When the silver fuselage of the machine dwindled to a barely visible point on the horizon and then vanished entirely beyond the curve of the earth, Poon felt a physical pain in his chest, as though someone had drawn all the air from his lungs and replaced it with hot, heavy lead. Months of superhuman struggle, desperate fishing, catching rainwater in canvas sheets, fighting sharks and the burning sun, all of it suddenly lost any meaning whatsoever, becoming merely a cruel joke of the universe. The will to survive, which had until now burned in him like a wild, untamed fire, suddenly shrank to the size of a weak, dying ember that no longer gave warmth or light. He understood with terrifying clarity that he had exhausted his quota of miracles, that no one would come to his rescue, and that this piece of wood would be his coffin. Hope, which for so long had been his most powerful weapon, had now proven to be his greatest tormentor, dealing a final blow from which there was no longer any possibility of rising. Instead of screaming, instead of waving his arms, Poon simply sank down onto the wet, rough planks of the raft, allowing the weight of his own depleted body to pin him to the surface. His emaciated body, resembling a skeleton wrapped in thin, parchment-like skin, arranged itself in a pose of complete capitulation, and every muscle, every tendon that had until now been taut in constant readiness to fight, now went slack in an act of ultimate surrender to fate. There were no tears. His body was too dehydrated to generate even a single drop of moisture. There was only dry, burning resignation that slowly infected every cell of his body.
The sense of isolation became so tangible that it took on an almost physical dimension, surrounding him like an impenetrable, suffocating cocoon, reinforcing his conviction that he was the last man on Earth, condemned to slow, solitary erasure from the register of existences.
Chapter 7. The Man Who Refused to Die. The 5th of April, 1943 began as had the 132 days before it, with the merciless, burning sunrise over the horizon that for nearly a quarter of a year had been Poon Lim's only point of reference in the infinite watery desert. Yet this time the air carried with it something utterly foreign, something he had forgotten across long months of agony. The smell of earth, wet vegetation, mud, and life, which slowly broke through the omnipresent nostril-irritating odor of salt, iodine, and the decomposing fish scraps on his raft. The water, until now terrifyingly crystalline in its deep oceanic blue, began taking on a murky greenish-brown hue, an unmistakable sign that the currents which had driven him so mercilessly into the unknown had at last pushed his disintegrating refuge into the broad, powerful estuary of a river at the coast of Brazil, where the forces of the ocean met the land. Poon Lim, balancing on the edge of consciousness, his body devastated to the limits of physiological possibility, initially dismissed this change in color and smell as yet another cruel illusion of his exhausted mind, a mirage designed only to prolong his suffering before his final surrender to the death with which he had been waging a quiet, fierce battle for so long. His eyes, deeply sunken in their hollowed sockets, ringed with layers of burned, peeling, scar-marked skin, stared at this changing landscape with a mixture of indifference and fading hope, while his dried lips, cracked by wind and sun, were unable to form even the quietest whisper of gratitude, as his mind slowly began to register that the surrounding world had at last ceased to be purely a bottomless abyss and was becoming a place in which there existed a chance of salvation, a chance to break free from the embrace of the ocean that had been trying to swallow him for over 4 months. Meanwhile, just a few miles away, 3 Brazilian fishermen, men with faces tanned by sun and wind, had set out in their small, well-worn wooden boat on a morning catch in the murky waters of the estuary, with not the faintest notion that this apparently ordinary day would be inscribed forever in the history of human endurance, when their routine activities would be interrupted by a sight that would leave its mark on their memories forever. The morning mist, lazily drifting above the water surface, slowly began to settle under the influence of rising temperature, revealing before their eyes a strange, unnatural shape floating on the distant waves, a shape that resembled neither a drifting tree trunk nor a fragment of a local boat, but rather a collection of bleached wood and tattered materials that had no logical reason to be drifting where it was, yet undeniably carried the silent weight of a human story.